Shalom and welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Vayyeshev, your host. Thank you guys so much for jumping on here and listening. It's been a big week. This last Sunday, we were actually at an Israel festival in Memphis, Tennessee, and it was pretty amazing to be there and to just see so many people who are excited about what's happening in the land of Israel and supporting Israel in different ways. It's a really unique event where the Jewish community in Memphis and the Christian community in Memphis are partnering together to put on this huge event. There was huge things, a real family-oriented event with fun things, a big blow-up, deals for the children to play on, and corn toss, and there was even a climbing thing outside, and camels and goats, and a whole bunch of like a petting zoo type thing with animals out there, and it was really pretty amazing event. There were several speakers there. I actually got to speak at the festival, and then Mr. Abe Hawk. It's a really interesting fellow. You should look him up. Abe Hawk. It's Haak. Spoke there. Has a crazy story. He was actually has a Jordanian citizenship and was born into a Palestinian home, and has a crazy story about how he grew up with with all the what you would imagine, the thoughts about Israel would be in a Muslim Palestinian home. But then he actually moved to the U.S. and realized that the story was a little bit different than what he had been told growing up, and realized that Israel is not what he thought it was. And so he's very educated and knows his facts, and is very good at articulating them in a way that's very understandable. He actually speaks on a lot of college campuses and different places like that where there's a lot of anti-Israel rhetoric going around, and he's very gentle and with his the way he articulates things, and has been very effective in talking to people and helping show them how he went from where he came from to where he is now. And he even told some stories about how he went on, into some lectures that he was giving, and he saw people come in with their poster boards that they were going to, hold up and try to heckle him or whatever, but they actually walked right back out with them and never used them during his whole talk. And it's hard to argue with him, because they walk in and he maybe he'll greet them in Arabic or say things to make them feel comfortable and make them realize that he's really not anti-Arab or anti-Palestinian. He is an Arab, like that is his background. And so, and I think that's some of the confusion that comes in with this pro-Israel thing. As soon as someone says they're pro-Israel, it's automatically assumed, well, they must be anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab, and that's not really the case. If Israel thrives, then the Arab population in Israel thrives. That's just the way it is. That's what's happening in the land of Israel. Israel thriving means more jobs, means a better life, a better living place to live for the Arab population that's in the land of Israel. And so he does an amazing job of putting all that into words, and I would really encourage you to look him up. Abe Hawk. Also, Stand With Us was there. There was a young lady there, Raina, who did a great job speaking, and showed one of their videos. If you haven't looked up Stand With Us, they're also a really great place to get educated about what's happening in Israel and some of the myths and truths about the land of Israel. And we were actually on a panel at the end of the conference. All the speakers all came up at the end, and different people would ask different questions, so this lady was talking about Stand With Us and about how a lot of the anti-Israel thoughts come about because of lack of education. People just don't realize who Israel is, and so I kind of followed up and said that it's necessary for us to know who Israel is. A lot of times people who try to speak out on behalf of Israel talk about what Israel is not, because there's all these attacks against Israel saying, oh, Israel's this, Israel's that, they're terrible because they do these things, and Israel has to say, no, we're not that, we're not that, we're not that, we're not that. And so I was just saying that I think it's important, especially for us who are pro-Israel, to know what Israel is, and not always be talking about what Israel is not, but tell people what Israel really is, what they're doing, what their motivations are for doing what they're doing. And so in order to do that, we have to be educated. We have to find out and get to know Israel. And the best way to get to know Israel, obviously, is to go to the land of Israel, to experience Israel. Obviously, that's a lot of, basically what we do is making a way for people to come into Israel, to get to know the land, to get to know the people, and understand where they're coming from, who they are. And to me, that's the best way for people to get educated, to understand who Israel is. If we're really pro-Israel, we need to get to know Israel so that we can tell people who she is and what she's all about. So it was a great festival. We had a booth there. A lot of people came up, and it was a huge opportunity. We're so grateful for it, to tell people about the land and bring that education. Also, David Kieran was there with his I Am Israel film. If you haven't seen the I Am Israel film, you definitely need to watch that. It's available. You can buy it online. The DVDs are available. I think the website is iamisraelfilm.com. And so you definitely need to check that out if you haven't seen the I Am Israel film. So this week's Torah portion is Vayyeshev, which means and he settled. And we're starting in Genesis chapter 37, going through chapter 40. This week's Torah portion, we have, starts out saying this is the generations of Jacob. And basically, it's interesting. It says these are generations of Jacob, and then basically the whole portion goes into talking about Joseph mainly. And then we have this really interesting little place where Judah and Tamar jump in with a very interesting story. So we have basically jumps right into talking about Joseph and how he, tattles on some of his brothers, basically, and the brothers aren't very appreciative of that. And then all of a sudden he starts having these dreams, and then gets sold away into Egypt. And the brothers go and lie to their father. And then Jacob's, in grief, he's going to grieve until the day he dies. And all of a sudden jumps in with the story of Judah and Tamar. And then pops back into the story of Joseph and has him being sold to Potiphar. And then we have this interesting story, crazy story of Potiphar's wife trying to pull Joseph into sin. Then we have Joseph going into prison. And then we have the baker and the butler and their dreams, and Joseph being able to interpret those, and then one being restored to his place and the other one being taken out by Pharaoh. So that's just kind of an overview of the Torah portion. And what I would like to really get into, because we have the festival of Hanukkah coming up here very soon. It usually starts on Tuesday night, December 12th, and goes through December 20th. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about Hanukkah, and I'll tie in the Torah portion a little bit. But I just really felt like I should share about this as we're moving towards this festival, that we could understand what we're heading into. And so basically, Hanukkah is a celebration of a Jewish victory over the Greeks, and it's a very miraculous story. If you haven't ever read the books of Maccabees, I would encourage you to go and do that. And there are some books, historical books too, that have been written to also tell the story. So get online, search those out. It's an incredible story. Some of these battles that were fought were like 60-1. And so the Greeks would have 60,000 soldiers with elephants and all of the latest, weapons of war. And then the Jewish people would just have 1,000 men with very simple weaponry, and the Jewish people would go and be victorious in the battle. And so the basics of the story is that the Greeks came in and took over and defiled the holy temple, and took over. And it's interesting because we can actually see how things work in cycles. A lot of people say if you study history, you can, see what's going to come to pass, and it's amazing how that works, because it is there's definitely some truth to that. We see even in the prophet Daniel, it talks about this the abomination of desolation being set up in the temple, and then we have the story of the Maccabees where this thing is being set up, and then even in the New Testament, we have in Thessalonians chapter 2, where it also has this same kind of story happening. And so it's interesting how God works like that, and how he has everything all set up. My brother Braden once did a little study on cycles and circles, and it was really pretty fascinating if you look at it. Like even the Earth itself, is round, and the planets and all these things that are round, and then you have the cycles of the year, cycles of the week, cycles of the day, all these different things that are in cycles. And then if you're into the feast, every year we have these different festivals that God has ordained. And there's just a lot of things, even down to what our physical makeup is, the different molecules and atoms and things. It's like even these little things are round. And so we have this idea that things work in cycles, that what goes around comes around. And so in Thessalonians chapter 2, just to kind of bring it home a little bit for us, and to bring out a couple of things here as far as the temple goes, here as Christians, in Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come," talking about the day when Messiah returns. It says, "unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God." And this is the exact thing that happened before, a couple hundred years before this is being written, is the Greeks came in and said, "No, the Almighty God of Israel, he is not God, and I am God, and I'm going to set up this statue of Zeus, which is a replica of King Antiochus himself, and we're going to set it up in the holy temple." So like exactly what it's talking about right here, this thing is going to happen in the future, had just happened a couple hundred years prior. And so the verse continues. It says that he will take his seat in the temple of God. So it's very specific. It's going to be in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things, and you know that what is restraining him now, so that he may be revealed in his time? For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Yeshua will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception, for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that this Antichrist person, this man of lawlessness, he takes his seat in the temple of God. Now, some people read this and they think, oh, okay, so if this is going to be the house of the Antichrist, then I don't really want to be pro-temple in Jerusalem, because this is going to be the place the Antichrist is going to reign from, and I don't want to have any part of that. But if you notice here, it says he takes up his seat in the temple of God. So this isn't the Antichrist temple. This is God's temple. And just like the story of the Maccabees, this abomination of desolation is being set up in the temple. But it's the temple of God. And what do the Maccabees do? And what are they very blessed in doing? Is going and cleansing the temple, of bringing basically God's presence back to the temple, and they experience all these miracles in the process. The other thing I want to point out is that in the scripture in Thessalonians, it says lawless, like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4 times, and then it also says the truth several times, and unrighteousness once there at the end. And so we see that this Antichrist who's coming in, he is a man of lawlessness. He does not believe in the Torah. You could say Torahlessness. And so as we're studying the Torah, this is very important, because by studying what the Torah is, we'll know how to recognize who this lawless one is, because he will be one who is against the Torah, one that is against the law, which obviously is very concerning with a lot of Christianity who believes that the law is done away with, because that's almost exactly what it's saying here. They're lawless. They don't have the Torah. If we're saying it's done away with, then we're actually agreeing with the Antichrist. So this is a very dangerous point. But even further than that, a lot of people who aren't, who are pro-Torah, who may be part of, accepting and the validity of the Torah and trying to follow its truths, a lot of times we don't recognize the importance of the temple, which is right here. It's the temple of God. And we need to be like the Maccabees in being law-abiding and recognizing that the temple of God needs to be restored so his presence can dwell in Jerusalem. And righteousness is an important thing. And tying this into the Torah portion, we have this whole story of Potiphar's wife who tries to pull Joseph into sin. And what does Joseph do? He's like, no, this is not going to happen. He runs away. He flees this lust, this potential of sin. And it's really an act of the will. And I think this is something that a lot of, especially Western culture that we live in, has a real problem with, is this act of the will. Everything's based off of feelings. Whenever we make decisions, whenever we decide that we're going to do something, it's because we feel like it. Well, I don't feel like doing that, so I'm not going to do it. And I think this willpower is something that we're missing out on. And I think it has a lot to do with just how we're raised. The reality is we have so much stuff and so much, there's not really as much responsibility as maybe have been in previous generations. And so there's a lack of training to use willpower. And so this definitely slides right over into moral things, because when all of a sudden you're faced with a temptation, if you're going to do what feels good, a lot of times you're going to do the wrong thing, and it's going to lead you to a place that obviously is going to be, lead to death, lead to more sin, lead to things that don't feel good in the end. But in that moment, maybe it feels good. And so I just want to encourage all of you who are listening is to learn how to use your willpower, learn how to decide. And obviously it's not of yourself. You have to ask God to help you, but God will give you the willpower to flee temptation. And so, but you have to ask him for it, and you have to be willing to do it. You have to be willing to say, okay, this is right, this is God's way, and I'm going to embrace his strength, and in that have the willpower to overcome temptation and to flee away from any kind of lusts. So continue the Hanukkah story. So we have this: the temple was destroyed, defiled, not destroyed, but defiled by the Greeks, and then we have the story of the Maccabees, this amazing, miraculous, victorious thing where they're able to come back in and rededicate the temple. And then once the temple was rededicated, they were able to find enough of the pure olive oil to last for 1 day. So they lit the menorah, but it actually lasted for 8 days. And so that is one of the big miracles that is celebrated during Hanukkah. Now, I've heard some people say, well, this story about lasting for 8 days, it's actually not even in the book of the Maccabees, and so I don't even know, if it's even reliable or why we even celebrate that part of it. Why can't we just celebrate the miraculous, victory that was had over the Greeks? And so I just wanted to point out that actually during this time, it sounds crazy for us in our culture today, but things that were passed on through storytelling were actually more reliable than things that were written down. Like if things were written down, then people just think, oh, just one person wrote that or whatever, and we don't even know if we don't hear the story from somebody else, then we don't know if it's reliable. But if a whole bunch of people are told a story, and and everybody that tells the story tells it the same way, then at that time they say, oh, this is a very valid story. And so by passing things down orally, that was actually the way people did things. A lot of things weren't written down, even a lot of Jewish literature and different things that we have today, and even their books, the Talmud, the Mishnah, these things weren't compiled until a long time even after Yeshua's time. So at that time, it was very important to tell stories, to repeat things orally, and then to pass those things down from generation to generation, and to keep the storyline the same. And that's the way it was during the time. If you study even back during Yeshua's time, even some of the Gospels in the New Testament were written down for little whiles after, because there was this whole idea of passing things on orally, by word of mouth, by telling stories. And that's why people used parables and stories like that, because it was a way of teaching that was easy to remember and easy to keep the story the same as you pass it down from generation to generation. So that would be the case I would make with this whole thing, is that a story that's passed down orally is still trustworthy, especially handed down from the Jewish people, because they have been very good at passing things down generation to generation very accurately. Another thing to mention about Hanukkah is that it's actually mentioned in the New Testament in John chapter 10. It says that Yeshua actually was in Jerusalem in the temple during the Feast of Dedication, which Hanukkah actually means like dedication. Hanukkah is also called the Festival of Lights because of the menorah. Another thing to note from a Christian perspective is that this attack on the Jewish people during the Maccabees' time, the Greeks' attack on them, is an obvious attempt to take out the Jewish people before Messiah came, before Yeshua came into the world. The Messiah, according to the Bible, has to come through Judah, from the line of Judah, from the lineage of King David. And so it seems very obvious that just a few hundred years before Yeshua came was born in Bethlehem, this was an attack of the enemy, of Satan, to try to come in and wipe out the Jewish people before this huge miraculous thing happened of the Messiah coming into the world. So for us, Hanukkah is definitely a festival that should be celebrated by all believers in Yeshua, and as Christians, we should celebrate this, because this is God preserving the lineage for Messiah to be able to come. And this thought also adds a lot of significance to the time we're living in right now, because, looking back through history, when were attempts made to destroy the Jewish people? Obviously, World War II, the Holocaust, these things was an obvious attempt again to take out the Jewish people. And so what happened right after that? Israel was born. The Jewish people began to stream back into their land, and the land itself began to respond. And so this is an extremely exciting time to be alive. Just like those times, Satan, the enemy, tried to take out the Jewish people before Messiah came, and then now tried to take out the Jewish people again. But despite all of this hardship and horrific things that happened, the Jewish people have pushed through, and God has given them the strength to rebuild Israel and to come back to their ancient homeland, to repossess the land. And now the land is responding to that, and that's why we see these vineyards growing on the mountains of Samaria. 30 years ago there were no vineyards, and now just this year our volunteers harvested almost 500 U.S. tons of grapes on the mountains of Samaria. This is phenomenal. It's something that is happening right now, and it's something that the Christian world is largely unaware of, and we need to connect to it. This is something that God's doing in the world today, and so it's something that we need to know about and take part in. I listened to a very interesting commentary by Rabbi David Foreman talking about some comparisons between this whole Maccabee story and the Exodus from Egypt. So you guys could go back and take a look at that. If you've seen his stuff, you can go to alephbeta.com. He's got some really, really interesting teachings on Hanukkah, about what the menorah is all about. Why do we celebrate the miracle of the 8 days of oil? There's a lot of miracles that happened throughout the Bible. The Red Sea splitting, the burning bush. And so basically, to put it really short, he says that this fire that burned in the menorah wasn't just a miracle of the oil lasting, but it was a miracle of the fire actually coming down. And where else do we see fire in the Bible? We see fire in the burning bush, right? The bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. And so he's saying this is God coming down and visiting his people. So it's the same thing here with the story of the Maccabees. So hope you guys have a very blessed Hanukkah and Feast of Dedication. Thanks so much for listening, and Shabbat Shalom. May you guys have a very wonderful Shabbat.
Restoration.